Alright guys, welcome back. We're up to topic 5.10, Reconstruction. We are going to have two videos on Reconstruction, 5.10 and 5.11, and that'll close out period 5 of the APUS history curriculum. So, let's get into the details of Reconstruction, try to figure out what's going on there, and also how America was changing during this period. So, Reconstruction is one of those time periods where everyone knows the Civil War, but Reconstruction is kind of that thing that, we know what it is. We kind of don't know all the details. We just have to know it's something after the Civil War. Turns out it's a really important part of American history. It's as we're going to get into the details, a lot of important rules and laws are going to come from this time period, and it's also one of these kind of missed opportunities in American history. What could have been, but what wasn't. Now, before we get into all that, though, let's think about passing constitutional amendments. And the reason I'm asking this is there are three big constitutional amendments that come out of the Civil War / Reconstruction era. And as a review, to pass a constitutional amendment, three quarters of all the states must agree, which means it doesn't happen very often. Now, during this time period, the so-called Reconstruction amendments, this would be the 13th, 14th, and 15th. These are all incredibly important amendments. 13th is what finally puts an end to slavery. 14th is going to give citizenship to former slaves. And 15th will give suffrage to black men. Now, let's think about what happens as a result of the war. We talked about how during the war, thousands, actually hundreds of thousands, of slaves freed themselves by leaving the plantations, and they're going to keep moving once the war is over. You're going to have many thousands migrating all across the country, some of them going to the north, some of them moving to cities in search of work, some of them crisscrossing the south trying to reconnect with loved ones who may have been lost during the war or maybe lost earlier before the war and in a slave auction or something like that. And famously, you also have a group of so-called exodusters who left the South and headed to Kansas. Some 25,000 free people leaving and going to Kansas. Now, of course, exodusters is a reference to the Exodus, this biblical story of the Jews leaving enslavement in Egypt and going to the Promised Land. And I guess for these people, the Promised Land is Kansas. Now, let's also think about education. Remember, basically about 90% or so of slaves were illiterate before the Civil War, so it's going to take a monumental effort to turn that around and create an education system. And what we're going to see is there's a fair amount of sort of like charity work going on where people are raising money to buy land and build schools and buy textbooks and hire teachers. And a lot of these teachers are going to be white women heading down from the north. Many of them, they see this as kind of like their calling to help these people, these so-called freedmen, to, start a new life with some education. All right, the Freedmen's Bureau. So this is going to be a government organization established at the end of the Civil War to try to deal with all those challenges of having a massive population of now freed, but also illiterate and frankly desperately poor people. How do you clothe and feed and take care of these people? How do we transition them into freedom, something that they'd never had before? And so the Freedmen's Bureau is led up by General Oliver Howard, of which Howard University is named for, and they have a pretty big task before them. Now, as a result of this effort to increase education, not only are we going to see primary schools being established and things like that, you're also going to see colleges being established, black colleges all across the South and a few of them maybe even up in the North as well. And since we live in Middle Tennessee, guys, a great example of one of these would be Fisk University in Nashville. This is it's been around. It's a historically black college. It's still going strong in Nashville today. All right, so this is obviously some anti-Freedmen's Bureau propaganda, right? And the message of this really awful cartoon is that with the Freedmen's Bureau, what's going to happen is these former slaves, again, they're called freedmen, freedmen are going to become lazy and just leech off the government as hardworking white people have to pay for that. And, you know, that was the message they're trying to sell. Pretty awful imagery, right, and message for that matter. And so it tells us there was a lot of resistance to this Freedmen's Bureau, not just in the South, obviously, but also in the North as well. Okay, so we can take the Reconstruction era and break it into three distinct phases. The first is called presidential Reconstruction. So Lincoln had a plan of being pretty lenient on the South, and you might ask yourself, well, why would he do that? You know, why would he be lenient on the South when they sparked the bloodiest war in all of American history? Why would he let them off so easily? And Lincoln really felt as if, you know, for America to go forward, we had to kind of let go of that hatred and animosity. And so one way to do that was to not permanently keep the South as like a subgroup within America or just punish them unnecessarily. It was time to embrace the South as Americans once again. In fact, Lincoln took the argument that the South had never really seceded because secession in his mind wasn't possible. You can't secede if secession is not allowed, which it wasn't. And so therefore he embraced something called the 10% plan, which would be basically the idea if you can get 10% of the voters in this formerly rebel state to agree to emancipation and take an oath of allegiance to America, then that was good enough. So 90% of the people could disagree with that, and they would still be considered like good enough to be let back in the Union when, again, Lincoln didn't really think they actually had left. Not very popular with Congress, though. A lot of people in Congress wanted to really stick it to the South and punish them for this war. So in the scheme of this whole political arrangement, guys, we've got two factions within the Republican Party during Reconstruction. You've got the moderates, who are the majority, who feel as, you know, Lincoln's doing the right thing. Let's be lenient on the South. But then you also have a radical faction who, like, you know, they're a minority, but they're also a very loud minority. They don't agree with Lincoln's plan. They want to use this as a golden opportunity to basically hit a giant reset button on the South and remake it from the top to the bottom. All right, let's now look at the so-called Black Codes. So if you recall earlier in our curriculum, in fact, the very first unit, we talked about the Barbados Slave Code, which was something that predated America and had basically influenced a lot of these so-called slave codes that had been passed in American states. And then, once the war is over, the Civil War is over, obviously slavery with the 13th Amendment is gone. You can't have slave codes any longer. So a lot of southern states simply basically changed the name and called them Black Codes instead. And the goals of these very stringent laws on African Americans in the South was to basically regulate their lives, keep them subservient, keep them as a permanent underclass that can be controlled by the white establishment in the South. So a couple of examples. If you were a freedman, you had to be able to show proof that you were employed. Otherwise, they'll call you a vagrant and they'll, you know, throw you in jail. And you also often had to sign a work contract with your employer. And oftentimes, these employers were the same people who had enslaved them during the war. And these contracts were designed to keep, again, African Americans poor and subservient. And you couldn't break a contract. You know, if you did, you could be hunted down, arrested, and then forced to work off that payment that you owed someone for your labor that you didn't do, which basically turns it back into slavery, right? It's almost like slavery by another name. So that was phase one. Phase two is going to be called Congressional Reconstruction. So in 1866, the Republicans in Congress passed something called the Civil Rights Act. and this would grant citizenship to freedmen. It would also kind of try to beat down some of the more horrible aspects of the black codes. But the thing about a law is it can always be overturned later. So thought turned to, maybe we should enshrine these in a constitutional amendment. And so then that leads us to the 14th Amendment. So what the 14th Amendment does is it establishes two big principles. One, birthright citizenship. What that means is if you're born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. And this was an attempt to gain suffrage for freedmen. And this, of course, is a rejection of earlier laws and regulations we had seen. And so now, again, they're legally citizens. Freedmen are. Secondly, it's also going to establish this idea of equal protection of the law. So equal protection of the law simply means that you can't treat certain groups differently. You can't grant privilege to some and then punishments to other. Everyone has to be treated the same before the law. All right, our third and final phase is going to be called military reconstruction, and this comes in March of 1862. So the South was really dragging its feet on, basically respecting a lot of these rules and laws, and so the North decided to break the South into 5 military districts and then send thousands of American soldiers, Union soldiers, down there to patrol and enforce federal law. Now you'll notice Tennessee was not part of this because Tennessee had already been readmitted, because Tennessee was the last state to leave the Union and the first to re-enter it, which is, I think it shows you that there was a fair amount of reluctance to secede in the first place in Tennessee. But other states here, you can see how they're broken down into these districts. Now, if a state wanted to be fully readmitted going forward, and that means getting, the Union soldiers off your soil, you had to agree to ratify the 14th Amendment, and you also had to agree to place suffrage for freedmen in the state constitutions. Now, the thing is, state constitutions could be changed later, of course, right? So that's going to bring out another constitutional amendment here called the 15th Amendment. This was to guarantee going forward in all states that you could not be denied suffrage based on race, color, or previous condition of servitude. And that, of course, is a reference to slavery. This is our third of our 3 big Reconstruction amendments. 13th ended slavery. 14th gives citizenship to freedmen. 15th gives freedmen the right to vote. And with the right to vote comes, of course, the possibility of holding office. And what we're going to see is a remarkable change. Between 1868 and 1876, we're going to see 14 black men elected to Congress, 2 senators elected. We're going to have lieutenant governors and all kinds of other lower officials filled out by black men. And this was, again, think about how amazing that is. This was the South that just a couple years before considered these men legally property. It had 0 civil rights, and now they're in positions of power. That is a major turn of events. All right, last thing in this video is the issue of suffrage for women. Now remember, the 15th Amendment didn't say anything at all about gender. It addressed, your race. You couldn't be denied suffrage based on race, but it didn't say anything about gender. So this is where a lot of women start to kind of distance themselves with some of these efforts. And in fact, what you're going to see is some women actually actively campaigning against the 15th Amendment in particular because it didn't address the issue of gender. Okay, guys, so that is our next to last video on Reconstruction and, on the topic of Unit 5 altogether. And we will now move on to our last video where we talk about the failures of Reconstruction and a lot of the missed opportunities of Reconstruction.